Good morning. It's an honor to be here. I want to thank Endeavor, Aloha, the board members for this invitation. When Aloha reached out to me a few months ago, she said I would have 15 minutes to talk to you about entrepreneurship and how it has the potential to lift Nigeria out of poverty and create prosperity. Normally, when I speak, they give me about an hour, at least. And so it's tall order. I'll do my best. But if you don't learn anything from what I say today, these are the three main points I want to make. The things that we believe, point number one, the things that we believe essentially reinforce our actions. And so we put our beliefs into actions. That's number one. So it's very important we figure out what we believe. The second point is that bold entrepreneurship is not just the key to Nigeria's prosperity. Bold entrepreneurship is actually the only thing that can get us on a path to a prosperous Nigeria. And the third point, which I'll be very clear about, is it's largely the folks in this room that have the most potential to begin to transform this country. So those are the three key points I would like to make. Just a little bit of background. I grew up in Nigeria. When I was 16, I left the country to go to college in the United States. I left like many people do, with a one-way ticket and no intentions of ever returning. Because as far as I was concerned, there was no opportunity. It was incredibly difficult to make ends meet. When you wanted a job, you had to know people. And so I just didn't see a future in Nigeria for me. So I went to the US, studied, I got a job, and I didn't come back home for 8 years. And in 2008, as I was working, I began reading books on development and economics and poverty. And it struck me like nothing had ever struck me before. I studied engineering in school, and with engineering, you don't really have to read a lot of books. You just have to know the equations and the formulas. But as I was reading, staying up till 2, 3 in the morning with these books and having to go to work the next day, something happened in me. And I sort of figured out what I wanted to do with my life. But the thing that got me was when I read about a 10-year-old girl from Ethiopia who had to wake up every morning at 3 a.m., walk miles, fetch firewood, sell so she could fend for herself and her family. It was February 2008. I was in my room and I was crying. I was crying not because about that girl specifically, but I was crying because that story is representative of tens of millions of children on this continent. See, no 10-year-old person anywhere in the world deserves to live a life like that. And so that's when I knew I had to figure out how to reintegrate into Nigeria. So August of that year, I came back and started a nonprofit organization. I did that because most of the literature I read talked about the solutions coming from two sectors, the government or the aid industry. And few books I read talked about the power and potential of business. And so I started a nonprofit, and we started building wells in different communities. I was fortunate to raise a few $100,000. After we built 5 wells, virtually all the wells broke. And that's when I knew something was wrong with that strategy. It was not sustainable. And so to cut the long story short, I went back to school. I was fortunate to win the lottery, and I went to Harvard Business School. That's where I met Clay Christensen, and he changed the way I think. So Clay Christensen is one of our professors. He's the author of a book called The Innovator's Dilemma, Disruptive Innovation. And he's very popular in not just the Silicon Valley world, but in business globally. And after I took his class, I began to see the world differently. He came to me and said, Efosa, what if we write a book about innovation and development? And so that's what I focused my life on after graduation. So I'd love to share with you about some of the ideas in our book called The Prosperity Paradox. I think most of you have gotten a copy. I hope that you would get a chance to read the book. So one of the things I start with anytime I talk about poverty is this slide. Now, I speak a lot, and I love this slide because when it comes up, I ask people what country this is. The demographics are such that 70% of people live in rural areas. About 2 out of 10 kids dies before the 5th birthday. Electrification is about 20%. The average household spends more than 50% of their income on food. 10% of people are in secondary school, and life expectancy is 45 years in this country. So whenever I ask, of course, I get mostly countries in Africa: Mali, Niger, Malawi, Sudan, Somalia. On occasion, I would get Afghanistan. But then I would tell people, this isn't any of those countries. I've actually never gotten Nigeria, so I think that's a good thing. I tell them this is the United States of America. And they look at me as if I'm crazy. Like, how could this possibly be America? And I say, it's not America today. It was America 100 to 150 years ago. And while no two countries are identical, there are similarities between the state of the US then and the state of many low-income countries today. So when we looked at governance in the US, what we found was over 90% of jobs at that time were gotten because you knew somebody in the government. So it was nepotism. Similar in many low-income countries today. When we looked at the level of corruption, which we dedicated a whole chapter to in the book, titled Corruption. Well, I'll let you read the title of the chapter. Right, we dedicated it to corruption because if we're going to write a book about innovation and development, we had to make sure we hit on some of the core issues that people mostly complain about. And so the question we asked was, how did America go from where it was to where it is today? And this is what we found. Bold entrepreneurship. Bold entrepreneurship through market-creating innovations. So this is a sewing machine. Now, the sewing machine was democratized by an entrepreneur named Isaac Singer. So in 1851, he started his company, and his focus wasn't just selling a sewing machine to the richest in society. Because hard as it may be to believe, back then, if you were an average American, you had 1, 2, maybe 3 sets of clothing. That was it. So only the wealthy people had access to much clothing. So he looked at the sewing machine and said, how can I develop a product that can democratize access? And that's what he focused his engineering efforts on and his business model on, democratizing access to the average American who was poor at the time. And so he took productivity from the sewing machine, which it would take the average person about 14 hours to sew a shirt, to 1 hour to sew a shirt. But that wasn't all he did. He began focusing on the business model, came up with many of the practices that we use today. So he developed branch offices, sales offices, training, so that when he sold a product, he provided training, service, after-sales service, and selling on credit, so that with just $5 down, you could get access to a sewing machine. Again, this is the US 1850s, before there was electrification, before there was mass education, before there were credit scores. And he focused on building this business model. And I think what's important is to see all the things that this pulled into the economy. Now, these are all the things this $100 sewing machine pulled into the economy, largely because it focused on democratizing access, on making products simple and affordable so that the average person in society could get access to it. Now, one that many of us are familiar with is the next slide, which is Henry Ford. Now, Henry Ford was another American entrepreneur, and it's the Ford Motor Company today. So cars back then were sort of like private jets today. The luxuries, things that only the wealthiest in society had access to. So Henry Ford comes around and says, I'm going to make a car for the average American. As a result of him saying that, because at the time he made cars like most other entrepreneurs in the US who were in the car business for the wealthiest people. And so they would custom make your cars. But he said, I'm going to look at the average American and make a car for them. Cars back then cost about $10,000 in those times. So he lost several investors after he made that decision. But he was determined. I mean, that's called bold entrepreneurship. Now, in order to make the car for the average American, where this was a country that didn't have roads. They didn't have roads for cars. And you're telling people you're going to make a car for the average American. People did not know how to drive. Again, cars were like planes, so you needed technical expertise to be able to operate a car. But he fundamentally changed his business model and invested in all these things to make sure the average American could get access to a car. When that happens, it pulls in so much into the economy that it transforms the economy. And so shortly after, the US started a huge road building transformation and began building roads across the country. And one of the things that we found out was when you look at road construction in the US back then, it's improved a lot. For every 10 naira the government spent on road construction in the early 1900s, they got about a naira worth of roads. And so there was massive leakage, massive corruption, but the boom of having the car was able to provide the tax base to fund the construction of roads. And in addition to that, all the jobs that were being created, the productivity the country began to enjoy, created a prosperity with the citizens in a way that they were now empowered to tell the government, yeah, you have to behave. You have to behave better. And so you began to see this evolutionary dynamic happen. As people became more prosperous, as they got access to these innovations, they began to demand more from their governments and say, you have to be better. And as a result, things got better. There was a lot more transparency. There were a lot more policies that led to much more development and prosperity. Americans were clamoring for much better government. I mean, that's why they had the American Revolution. They wanted no taxation without representation. But they were not able to get it until they began to create prosperity for as many Americans as possible. The last thing I'll end on is this product, largely because I ate it as a child. In fact, my mom got really worried because I could eat Indomie Noodles morning, noon, and night. I think Indomie it seems like sort of a flimsy product, 50 naira. But when I look at all the things that the company has to do to get one pack of noodles to the average Nigerian, again, not the wealthiest of Nigerians, making Indomie simple and affordable so the average Nigerian could get access, you begin to see the kind of development that can happen. So in our book, we provide evidence, many case studies for how bold entrepreneurship through market-creating innovations. These are innovations that make products and services simple and affordable so many people can afford them. We provide evidence for how that has transformed many countries. And that sort of creates the space for development to happen. So my hope is that you definitely read the book, but I think more importantly, I hope you would begin to look at your business models and say, are we democratizing access to the average Nigerian? Regardless of what sector you're in, are we really democratizing access so the average Nigerian who earns roughly 43,000 naira a month can get access to our products? And if your business models are not doing that, then it's going to take a long time for prosperity to come. But if they are, that's when we can really begin to turn the ship for prosperity in this country. Thank you.